With the 2024 presidential election less than 10 hours away, we'll be taking a look at my final 2024 presidential election prediction between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. In this prediction, we'll be weighing 4 factors to determine who is favored to win the presidential election in each state. Firstly and foremost, my own opinion. Secondly, the early voting data that has came in. Thirdly, the poly market data, which is essentially a gambling market data, as well as finally the polling data that has been conducted. So today's video, we'll be finding out who is favored to win this year's presidential election so close to the actual election. Let's start off here with the safe states for Kamala Harris: Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, DC, Maryland, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Vermont, New York, Illinois, and Maine's 1st Congressional District are universally essentially considered safe districts and states for Kamala Harris. While for Donald Trump, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, the Dakotas, Montana, Nebraska's at-large 1st and 3rd districts, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Indiana, and Missouri are generally universally considered safe states for Donald Trump, as well as Alaska and South Carolina. Now, those are safe states for both parties. These are states that voted for both candidates and their respective parties by at least 10% back in 2020. If you don't know, a safe state is characterized, at least here, by a 12% or more margin of victory for either party. Now let's start off here with Donald Trump's likely states, because he is behind in the electoral vote count. Let's start off here with Iowa and Ohio. These two states are not particularly surprising. They're both states that Donald Trump are expected to easily carry. In the state of Iowa, we did see one surprising poll showing Kamala Harris with a 3% edge against Donald Trump, 47% to 44%. However, polling as well as Polymarket does not suggest that Donald Trump would end up losing the state of Iowa, and I would not expect that to occur. Iowa is still safely in the Republican column, essentially. Ohio's a state, again, where there's a competitive Senate race, but this presidential race there is simply not competitive. Donald Trump will easily cruise to victory in the state of Ohio. Now, for some of the other states that are considered likely Trump, the state of Texas right now is definitely considered likely Republican. If you look at the betting markets here in Texas, Trump has a 96% chance of victory, with the early voting there looking really good for him, as the Republicans are up by 13% in Texas's early voting. That's not really going to be that competitive of a state. In Florida, we see a similar phenomenon, with Republicans leading Democrats in the early voting by 10 percentage points in terms of party registration. In 2020, with a similar number of ballots cast in the early voting, Democrats actually outnumber Republicans, and Democrats still lost in the state of Florida. Thus, Florida also doesn't produce much hope for the Democratic Party at all. Up, we're going to go to the 4 states where Kamala Harris is almost guaranteed to win. These are 4 likely states. These are going to be more competitive than the safe states, but nevertheless, no party is going to really contest them by pouring millions of dollars or actually physically campaigning in any of these states. So Colorado, New Mexico, Maine's at-large vote, as well as Virginia are considered likely for Kamala Harris. This is because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in 2020 was able to win by at least 9% in each of these states. 13.5% in Colorado, 10.8% in New Mexico, 10.1% in Virginia, and 9.1% in Maine's at-large vote. Donald Trump will also carry Maine's 2nd district here by about 10%. That is also considered likely Republican. Now, the other states on this map here that have not been characterized yet are generally the most competitive states of this election cycle. But I want to really get rid of 3 of these states/districts so far, as they're going to be really leaning towards Kamala Harris quite significantly, although they're going to be, in my opinion, under a 5% margin for Kamala Harris. Let's start off here with the state of Minnesota. In the state of Minnesota right now, Donald Trump has only about a 10% chance of victory, according to Polymarket. That's comparable to a state like Ohio or a state like Iowa. Thus, it's definitely not very competitive. It's also not listed as a top battleground, and Kamala Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, is from the state of Minnesota. Those factors should be able to boost Kamala Harris to at least about a 4 to 5% margin of victory in the state of Minnesota. The next state on this list here would be the state of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire, I do expect to be at least somewhat competitive. We have some actual early vote data from there. We have a total of 6 votes from Dixieville, which is essentially up in the northern portion of New Hampshire. What we see there is that there have been 3 votes in favor of Kamala Harris and 3 votes in favor of Donald Trump. In 2020, that same precinct gave 5 votes to Joe Biden and 0 votes to Donald Trump. So at least based on the numbers in Dixieville, we might be seeing some type of shift there. That being said, Republicans generally have to win Dixieville in order to actually win the statewide election. Now, if we look at the state of New Hampshire, there's another advantage here for Kamala Harris. The state is very white college educated, and that was a type of demographic that really shifted in favor of Biden in 2020. Hillary Clinton won the state by 0.3%, while Joe Biden won the state by 7.3%, thanks to pretty substantial improvements in areas like Merrimack County and Hillsborough County and Rockingham County. In fact, some of these moderate-sized towns in the state of New Hampshire has the highest percentage of college graduates across the entirety of the United States. That is another favoring point in favor of Kamala Harris. Thus, the state of New Hampshire is considered lean blue. Additionally, Nebraska's 2nd District, a district heavily trending towards the Democratic Party, due to the fact that it's a very urban/suburban district around Omaha. It's a district that has a pretty substantial college-educated population, and it's the type of area you'd expect Democrats to do quite well in, at least in the current Trump era. Thus, you have the state of Nebraska is considered a lead Democratic district as of right now. Let's start off here in the state of Nevada. We're going to start off here with the 3 fundamentals. Let's start off here with early voting. In early voting right now, it definitely does not seem the most promising for the Democratic Party. In the state of Nevada, about 1.35 million votes were cast in total back in 2020. And this time round with the early voting, we're approaching 1.1 million ballots. That suggests most of the vote is in. And right now, Republicans have a 4% lead in early voting in terms of party registration. That's significant because Democrats led by 3% at the same period of time back in 2020. And in fact, Republicans actually vote more on Election Day, which is a really good sign for the Republican Party. Additionally, Republicans do lead in polling in the state of Nevada right now. If you look at the top battleground polling here, it's about a 0.6% advantage for Donald Trump, which is small yet significant because polls generally underestimate Donald Trump. Because again, a lot of these voters are hesitant to say their true preferences because there's a lot of hatred towards Donald Trump in the general media. Additionally, if you look at Polymarket here, Trump also has about a 62% chance of winning the state of Nevada, which is another point in favor of Trump. Additionally, there's a pretty substantial Hispanic population around Clark County, which has been trending towards the Republican Party in the past decade or so, especially in the Trump era. We saw that despite the popular vote moving more than 2% in favor of Joe Biden, Clark County did move into the Republican column back in 2020. Thus, the state of Nevada at this moment in time is considered leaning towards the Republican Party. I think Trump will win the state by around 2.0%, which is just over a lead characterization. Now going to the state of Arizona. In Arizona right now, we also see pretty good numbers and pretty promising numbers for the Republican Party. Again, roughly 2/3 of the total ballots in 2020 are in the state of Arizona, and Republicans outnumber Democrats by 9%. In 2020, Democrats also was outnumbered by Republicans, but by a much slimmer, about 4 to 5% margin. The fact that this is a 9% margin is pretty significant because Biden only won the state by 11,000 votes. So essentially, any type of shift, even a fraction of 1%, may be enough to swing the state of Arizona for the Republican Party. Additionally, there's a lot of voter fatigue in the state of Arizona in terms of the fact that a lot of voters who may have voted for Romney in 2012 John McCain in 2008, those were Republicans who won Arizona by 7 to 8%. They did not vote in 2016, voted for Biden in 2020, held their nose because they did not like Donald Trump. This time around, are choosing not to vote again because they're frustrated by the economy as well as the border. Of course, Arizona does border Mexico, which is another point in favor of the Republican Party. As long as these voters don't end up voting for Kamala Harris, you're not going to see Democrats win the state because Republicans still dominate over Democrats in terms of voter registration as well as general party ID in the state of Arizona. And thus, I will give the state right now to Donald Trump by a lead margin, which is consistent with some of the polling. You're seeing right now in Arizona about a 2.8% lead for Donald Trump in the state of Arizona in polling, as well as the fact that Polymarket does give Trump about a 79% chance of winning, which is by far the highest of any swing state. That is comparable to the state of Iowa. Now going to the next state here, the state of Georgia. Again, another state that does favor the Republican Party in terms of voter registration. Over 4 million ballots have been tabulated, which is about 80% of the 5 million ballots total counted across Georgia in 2020. Now, probably election day turnout won't be all that high, and this number is actually pretty good for Democrats. Democrats trailed Republicans by 7% in early voting back in 2020, 50% to 43%. However, Democrats have gained a little bit in registration across the state of Georgia because, again, a lot of these voters who are registered as Republicans voted for Biden in 2020, so that's nothing that's super significant. And Georgia polling is historically quite accurate, and right now Trump does have a 1.3% lead in the state of Georgia, which is promising because Trump was essentially down about 1.2% on 538 on election day in Georgia. He ended up losing the state by 0.3%, so polls are pretty good here. And the fact is, Trump is still slightly underestimated in both 2016 and 2020. Thus, these numbers are pretty promising for Trump, the fact that he's going to win the state narrowly. Now, what the state is going to come down to is probably the suburbs. We're talking about areas like Newton County, Henry County, Gwinnett County, Cobb County, these very populated areas. Specifically, areas like Gwinnett or Cobb County, which make up like 8% of the population of the state of Georgia each. These areas are heavily populated. They are areas where Kamala Harris is trying to improve, but Republicans have one advantage. Republicans, specifically Donald Trump, is making inroads in some of these more predominantly minority type of areas, especially with Gwinnett County, Fulton County, DeKalb County with black voters. If Trump is able to make those inroads, it could be difficult for the Democratic Party to end up winning the state. And that could be the problem that ends up really killing Democratic chances across Georgia. And when we look at the betting markets here as well, 70-30 in favor of Trump. So these are pretty promising numbers for Trump as well. Georgia is also considered leaning towards the Republican Party. I expect Arizona to vote for Trump by like 2 to 5 to 3, while Georgia by about 1 to 5 to 2. Now going to the state of North Carolina. North Carolina right now, according to polling, is much tighter than some of the other states that we've looked at, with Donald Trump up by just 1.2%. This is essentially the same margin as Trump won the state by back in 2020. Now, North Carolina is quite different from the other swing states. It is a state that Joe Biden actually lost to Donald Trump in 2020. So the thing about Democrats in North Carolina is that they have to kind of make up some voters. They have to win back some Trump voters they did not carry in 2020 or have some really high turnout in order to actually win North Carolina. And the problem is there's a lot of issues right now in the U.S., especially due to the economics. If you look at the GDP numbers right now, they're actually fine, but voters are just feeling a sense of really high inflation. The fact that some voters are unemployed, people are frustrated at the economy, people are frustrated that grocery prices have risen 25% in the past 4 years. Those are all problems in North Carolina. And Trump is going to make some inroads in the rural areas, especially the rural black areas, which he did make inroads in back in 2020. Kamala Harris will try and make inroads in areas like Wake County or Mecklenburg, but I really doubt that would happen. Because again, Democrats are kind of maxing out in the suburbs, and Kamala Harris generally is not all that popular. So when we look at betting markets again, about 67-33 to Donald Trump. And if you look at the early voting numbers here in the state of North Carolina, it's not looking too good for Democrats. Democrats had a pretty substantial lead back in 2020, and now they're actually down by 1%. Thus, I'm going to put the state of North Carolina again in a lead Republican column. I think Trump will win the state by about 2%. But now going to the final three states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the three states that will truly decide who wins the presidential election. Let's start off here with Pennsylvania. I think the easiest state to call of the three states. Like, I'm still not confident. These three states are going to be ultra competitive, and they're going to decide the election. Kamala Harris's best pathway here, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that gets her to 270 electoral college votes. And Kamala Harris's closing message was delivered in Pennsylvania. So let's look at Pennsylvania right now. According to the early/absentee ballots, Donald Trump is trailing the Democratic Party by 23%. Now that might seem like a pretty big gap, but Trump was actually trailing by about 50% at the same moment in time back in 2020. That being said, more Republicans are voting by mail, and Democrats are less afraid of the pandemic, and thus some of them are choosing to vote in person on Election Day. So these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt. So let's look at what polling as well as the pundits predict. If you look at the poly market, which is again people gambling their money, you see that Pennsylvania is 60-40 in favor of Trump. That's a pretty significant event because in 2020, the numbers were like 80-20 in favor of Biden, and Biden barely won the state. Trump is consistently underestimated in polling here, as well as by some of the pundits, yet he is leading by 20%. Another point in Trump's favor is the fact that he is actually leading in Pennsylvania polling. That is significant. In 2020, Joe Biden led in the polls in Pennsylvania in the week upcoming to the election by between 5 and 7%. Guess what? He only won by 1.2. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had between a 7 to 8% lead in Pennsylvania in terms of the polling, and guess what? She actually lost the state. So you're really going to see this number being quite significant. There's a lot of the silent Trump vote, and I know there might be some silent Harris voters as well, because voters are frustrated about the economy, about inflation, about immigration. Some voters may be reluctant to say they're supporting Harris, but historically, if you look at the previous few elections, voters are far more hesitant to say they're going to support Trump because he is more controversial of a character. Thus, you're really going to see Pennsylvania. I think this number is pretty good for Trump. Now, a third factor to consider is essentially the demographics in Pennsylvania. A pretty important demographic in Pennsylvania is the rural voters, and that's going to be something that hugely favors Donald Trump. Trump was able to get massive turnout from the rural areas. That is because, again, he does have that type of appeal, and in 2024, turnout will probably be even higher in the rural areas, because if you look at areas like Butler County, Trump was nearly assassinated in Butler. You're going to see more Republican enthusiasm around that area. That might just be 5, 6, 7,000 votes more for Trump, but that does make a difference. Trump is also very popular in rural areas as well. We're talking about voters really liking him more because they're frustrated about the current situation. You might see slightly higher turnout in the rural areas, which does make a big difference. Another area that could be problematic for Democrats, look for Philadelphia. Okay, I don't know what happened right there, but anyhow, Philadelphia County shifted 5% in favor of Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election. This is a county with 735,000 votes, if not a bit more than that, in 2020. Even a slight shift there could be extremely significant. You're really going to see a lot of these voters, they're voters who are more union voters. These are more white working class voters. These are voters that may be frustrated with the Democratic Party who are moving towards the Republicans. Even a few thousand of those voters do make a difference. And finally, areas like Bucks County, Lehigh County, Northampton County, Monroe County, Lackawanna County, as well as Erie County, these are more white working class voters. These are voters that supported Obama by huge margins in 2008 and 2012, who flipped to Trump in 2016. Kamala Harris simply does not have a winning message to win over those voters, and you can expect Donald Trump to make even more inroads in those voters, and thus that's another point in Trump's favor. Kamala Harris does have 1 point. Joe Biden did win the state, but he did win it by that much. And thus Pennsylvania right now, in my opinion, goes to Trump by about 1% to about 1.5%. But now going to Wisconsin and Michigan, the two hardest states to call in this election. I'm going to start off here with Wisconsin. Poly Market has this state as a dead heat, 53% for Kamala Harris, I believe, and 47% for Donald Trump. I'm not sure why Poly Market is refusing to load. And you see those numbers right there. If you look at polling here, it's a very competitive race, plus 0.4 for Kamala Harris. And if you look at the 2020 presidential election, this is a state that voted for Biden by a very narrow margin. Now, the reason I still think that Trump is favored here is very simple. There are some good signs for the Kamala Harris campaign, specifically with early voting. Democrats are outnumbering Republicans by 9%, while in 2020, the opposite was kind of true. Republicans were outnumbering Democrats. However, you see this very high other number. It just shows that people are not very, they're not very enthusiastic to say, I'm going to be a Democrat, I'm going to be a Republican. So it's not really that sure of a side. In 2020, the other percentage was like 20%. This time it's 40%. So the early voting numbers aren't really that significant for Democrats. However, there are a few significant points for the Republicans. Again, in polling right now, it's a Harris plus 0.4% margin. However, in 2020, the margin was about Biden plus 8, and he only won the state by 0.63%. In 2016 as well, Hillary Clinton also had a similar lead, and she actually lost the state, so that's another point in Trump's favor. Additionally, if you look at Trump's appeal, he has a lot of appeal in some of these areas where you see a lot of blue dog voters, voters who are white working class again, that type of key demographic. You're going to see Trump do really well in those areas. And Democrats are kind of maxed out in areas like Milwaukee and Dade County, and thus you're not really going to see a lot of Democratic improvement. When all those things are considered, along with the fact that Biden only won the state by 20,000 votes, I do believe that Trump is favored to win the state of Wisconsin. Now going to Michigan, the state that I believe is the toughest to call of any of these states. Now, Michigan right now, if you look at Poly Market, that's about a 60-40 in favor of Harris. That is a pretty significant advantage to her because, again, just a few weeks ago, this was actually a state that was advantaged Donald Trump. And in the state of Michigan, here you see the early voting. There's not much of the other percentage, unlike the state of Wisconsin, so we can be more sure. And in 2020, the Republicans outnumbered Democrats by like 7 to 8%. This time around, Democrats and Republicans are tied. Other numbers not that high, which is a good sign for the Democratic Party. A concerning sign for Democrats could be that in the area around Detroit, especially with Arab Americans, a lot of those Arab Americans are doubtful to support Harris due to Biden's policy on the Israel-Hamas crisis. Joe Biden won Arab Americans by 21% in 2020, but right now polling showing a dead heat in that group of voters, which are quite predominant in Detroit. Another group of voters that could be problematic for the Democratic Party are young voters, especially in Washington County. In 2020, in the Democratic primaries, about 17% of all Washington County Democratic voters voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries. That is again in protest to the Democratic handling, especially Joe Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas crisis. And again, a lot of those voters who voted for Biden in 2020 may not feel enthusiastic to show out, which is another problem for Democrats. That being said, Democrats have one major advantage. Biden won the state by nearly 3%, which does offer Democrats a buffer. Democrats can afford to lose 154,000 votes technically and still win the state. With that being said, I do believe that Democrats are slightly favored in the state of Michigan just because they have that buffer, and thus Michigan does go in the Democratic column with Kamala Harris. Now, in summary, I do believe that Donald Trump is still the favorite to win the election. Of course, the three competitive states are Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Right now, I believe that, again, the Sun Belt is pretty solidly in the Trump column at this point, while Wisconsin and Pennsylvania being narrowly in favor of Donald Trump, and Kamala Harris narrowly winning the state of Michigan by around 0.5%. Again, Pennsylvania will probably be the tipping point state. You're going to see both candidates really fighting out there. And again, in just a few hours, we will start having the first signs of who the next president of the United States would end up being, whether that be Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So thank you for watching today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to see some live coverage of the election. I won't be live streaming during the first few hours, but at around 4 a.m. Eastern Time, I'm going to start live streaming and analyzing the results that have came in and who I think, if the race was not called by that point, would win the presidential election.